Hey everyone. As many of us know all too well, chronic fatigue isn't just feeling tired. It is a crushing exhaustion that levels you. For so many people dealing with ME/CFS and long COVID, the most frustrating part isn't just the exhaustion itself, it's the endless search for answers that might actually work. Because if more rest was the magic cure, we'd all be running marathons by now. If you're a longtime listener, welcome back. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'm Raelan Agle, and this is where we dive into real, raw recovery stories and hear directly from the experts on ME/CFS, long COVID, and other chronic conditions. No fluff, no gatekeeping, no outdated ideas, just what's actually working. Basically, all the stuff we wish someone had told us sooner. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Evan Hirsch, aka the Energy MD, tuning in from Washington, USA. Dr. Hirsch is a world-renowned fatigue expert, best-selling author, and the creator of the Energy MD method, a 4-step science-backed process for resolving chronic fatigue naturally. Today, he's breaking down the questions we're all hungry to understand. What causes chronic fatigue? Why it's so hard to treat? And what we actually need to do to get better. I know so many of you have been waiting for this interview, so let's dive in. Dr. Hirsch, it is so wonderful to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Raelan, thanks so much for having me on.
So your work is exactly aligned with what the people who watch this channel, the information that you're looking for. And before we dive into some of that, concrete information and strategies, I'm curious, how did you get into this specialty? What brought you here?
So I had my own story of chronic fatigue syndrome. So I was already practicing functional medicine when I got it. But I'll go back a little bit further. So I started my residency in 2004. I met my wife. We fell in love. And 3 months later, she couldn't get out of bed. And it lasted for the better part of 3 years. And it was an incredibly challenging time, not just the fact that I was going through my residency, but the fact that I couldn't help her. I felt really, I wasn't empowered. I didn't have that knowledge. I was going through a conventional medicine residency, family medicine at the University of Washington out here in Olympia, Washington. And I asked my attendings, I asked everybody that I could about chronic fatigue, and nobody really had any answers. So she got better with a lot of mental and emotional work. She did a sauna, she did adrenals, and she was mostly better in about 3 years. And then a number of years after that, in 2010, I started flagging and I started getting chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome. And I started napping underneath my desk. And it was like napping, the 1,000th day in a row or so. And eventually I realized that there was something I had to do. I was already practicing functional medicine. And so I was replacing my deficiencies. I was boosting my vitamins and minerals and hormones and mitochondrial health. And I was doing everything right from a lifestyle perspective. I was gluten-free, dairy-free, I was doing everything. And I was still napping underneath my desk every day. And I realized that I couldn't get there with functional medicine. And so I had to start looking for other things. So I went to environmental medicine and I started filling the gaps in my knowledge base. And so I ended up learning what I call now the toxic five, which is heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and then nervous system dysfunction. And that's what I really found that were the real root causes of my chronic fatigue syndrome and all the other people that I work with now. And so that's been my focus. I wrote a book about it that became a bestseller on Amazon. And now it's my mission to help 1 million people resolve their chronic fatigue syndrome. And then I was uniquely positioned to also help people with long COVID because the only difference is the spike protein, but all of the other causes are the same.
So this is I'm excited to dive into all of this because we definitely have a lot of people talking about how nervous system regulation has helped them on their recovery journey. But for many others, for some people, it's the whole puzzle piece.
Right.
Where other people, they're like, oh, it's helping a bit, but I'm still not there, which is really frustrating because it's working for so many other people. Right. So can you explain a bit about what's going on there and these other components that could be at play for them in their situation?
Absolutely. So when people join my program, I tell them, we don't know if your nervous system dysfunction is 90% of your issue or 10%. And so we have to go after it in earnest because a lot of people come to see me and they're like, I want to go after all the toxins. And it's like, yes, and you have to do the nervous system retraining as well. So I think part of the reason why this happens is, or why it helps some people and not others significantly, is because the toxins can also cause nervous system dysfunction. So they will cause damage to the nervous system. They will get into nervous tissue, whether it's heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections, all sorts of different kinds of infections. And so consequently, sometimes it's hard to retrain the nervous system while those toxins are still in there. If your nervous system dysfunction is largely from mental emotional issues like trauma, whether it's trauma with a big T or trauma with a small t, then I think you're going to get the most benefit. But it's always, I find that the reason why I combine it all in our program is because I find that people are more successful when we leave no stone unturned.
And it is interesting and nice to hear you say that nervous system regulation plays a role for everybody. It's just how big of a role does that play? Because I think part of the confusion is people is like, is this for me? Is it not? And the more doctors, the more experts I speak to, they say there virtually is no condition where it isn't a component of it. It's just how much.
Yeah.
So how do people start to address some of these other components that may be happening when they're facing conditions like ME/CFS and long COVID?
So I have a 4-step process that I take people through. I call it the Energy MD method. And this process is all about removing the toxic 5, but that doesn't happen until step 4. So oftentimes when people, if they're listening to this, they're like, oh, I've addressed heavy metals or chemicals or molds or infections. And I always felt worse when I was going through that process. And that's because you have to set the stage and you have to do it properly. And I've been working on this for the last decade. So this is based on my experience. So the first step is to figure out the causes that people have. What I've seen then is that everybody who has chronic fatigue syndrome and or long COVID has the toxic 5, and they also have adrenal gland dysfunction and mitochondrial dysfunction. You can't really have fatigue if you don't have damage to the mitochondria, since it makes 70 to 90% of our energy. So the question is, what other causes do you have? Do you have thyroid issues? Do you have sleep issues? Are you doing the right things for your lifestyle habits? And so those are kind of what we want to tease out in step 1. And then in step 2, we start by replacing the deficiencies that are present. You know how I talked about when I was practicing functional medicine and I couldn't get better just based on the deficiencies? The reality is that everything functions better when you replace the deficiencies. And this is what a lot of people do when they go to see a naturopath or an integrative doc or a functional medicine doc. They're replacing their adrenals and their mitochondria and their thyroid and their sex hormones, their vitamins, their minerals, the lifestyle habits. All of those are incredibly important and do need to be optimized in order for the rest of the process to go as smoothly as possible. Because by optimizing the deficiencies, you will decrease inflammation, you will improve your circadian rhythm, you will increase your energy just a little bit, which allows you to make some of the changes that need to be made. And then in step 3, we're opening up the exit pathways. This is the real reason why people don't feel well when they're trying to detoxify or get rid of toxins out of the body or infections, is because when you start to remove them, you have to have an exit strategy. And so I envision this kind of like a funnel. And essentially what you're doing is you need to open up the bottom of the funnel. Because if you're dumping the toxins in and getting rid of the infections, the bottom of the funnel has to be open. Otherwise, the toxins just go back into different parts of the body and cause more inflammation, cytokine storm, and make you feel worse. So we're opening up the liver and the kidneys and the lymph and the neural lymph, which is the garbage system in the brain, and the gallbladder and the intestines. So all those pathways really need to be open to a certain degree before then we can go into step 4 and remove the toxic 5, the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, and the nervous system dysfunction. And nervous system dysfunction really is being worked on from the beginning. And I tell people that, this is a 12-month process. And usually the magic happens around month 9 when you get rid of an appreciable amount of the toxic 5.
And how do you go about opening up these pathways? That makes a lot of sense, because I myself on my journey have done these different things to, detoxify and I can feel very, very sick after. And it sort of feels like you're flooded with poison, like your whole body's just, yeah. And it's all moving around, but then what? So how do you support that?
And you are essentially flooded with poison when that happens. So in step three, we're using, everything is natural that we use. Even though I have my MD, I'm 100% online now, practicing across state and national lines, which means I can help just about anybody in the world as long as they have an internet connection. And I can do this because everything that I do is natural. I'm not prescribing, I'm operating online as a coach. And so we're using herbs. We're using a combination of different herbs to support the liver and the kidney and the lymph and the neural lymph. We're making the body more alkaline using different salts. We're using blood cleansers. We're using a number of different things, and I'm happy to kind of go into some of the more specifics, but it's really like a combination of different products, and sometimes it depends on the individual that I'm working with. But we kind of start off with a certain amount that people need just to kind of open the pathways a little bit. And then there's the dance that ends up happening as you're removing the toxic five. In order to individualize this process and personalize it and figure out the rate that an individual can tolerate in terms of the amount of toxins and infections that we're pulling out of the body, that's kind of where we have to increase the amount of step three support to deal with the amount that we're trying to detoxify out of step four. And I use a lot of tinctures so that we can really get the right number of drops for the individual.
How does someone watching or listening right now know if this is the path that they should be taking? Because I know there can be overlap with symptoms for other conditions. So how do you know if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, if this is likely a route, that will be helpful for recovery? What's the best way?
So, I guess I'll answer the question about, how does somebody know if they have chronic fatigue syndrome? And, for people out there who are like, I've got my symptoms for 6 months. I have brain fog. I have severe exhaustion. I have post-exertional malaise, but I don't really have sleep issues. And maybe I don't really have body pain. Do I still qualify? And it's really important to remember that chronic fatigue syndrome, or myalgic encephalitis, which is what it's called outside of the United States, is a diagnosis. And the diagnosis does not tell you what the causes are. And it doesn't mean that you don't need help. What it does mean is that if you go to see a practitioner, a doctor, whomever, they're going to, if you don't have a certain diagnosis, they don't have a certain treatment for you. And so it becomes more confusing. But oftentimes on my website and in other places, I'm talking about this spectrum of chronic fatigue to ME/CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And the reason why is because the causes are the same with chronic fatigue and even with fibromyalgia. The question is just the location that you have. So if the toxic five are damaging the mitochondria and the adrenals and hormones and vitamins and minerals, then you're going to have fatigue with it. If they're affecting the muscles, you're going to have inflammation there, which is going to be fibromyalgia. If it affects both, and it also affects the central nervous system, et cetera, and you qualify for the diagnosis of ME/CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome, then you have that diagnosis. So I think it's very important, if you feel like crap and you have some of these symptoms, you have to realize that the toxic five is going to be present in everybody who has chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and long COVID. And so it's really important that you address all those. So that was the second part of the question. And then the first part of the question was about how do people know whether or not they should go after the toxic five? Is that correct?
Yes.
So if they have any of those symptoms that I mentioned, that what I have found is that everybody has the toxic five. So, when I tell people if they're not a good fit for me, I say, hey, you're not a good fit for what we do, but I still believe that you need to address the toxic five in order to get better. And people will, let me know a year later, yeah, I've been doing this work and I'm feeling so much better. So I think that it's involved in everybody that I see. And part of that comes from the testing that I've done over the last decade. I used to test people every 3 months, and in all of these different toxicities, the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, and the infections. And what I found over the course of 12 months is that all of them came out in the urine, in the blood, over that 12-month period. Now, generally, it wouldn't come out at 3 months. Maybe some of it would come out at 6 months, but once we've kind of gone through the process a little bit, opened up these pathways, then all of a sudden it's like a waterfall in the urine, seeing these toxins come out at 9 months, 12 months, and beyond. So I don't even test anymore because I've seen it so often. So now I know that everybody's got the toxic 5. It's just a question of how much of each do they need. And the testing is highly inaccurate just because the tests are basically a test of excretion. It's based more on your ability to get the toxins out of the body. That's mainly what you're testing, not what your total body burden is. So that makes it challenging. Plus, also, when you start to release, let's say, heavy metals, and heavy metals are attached to infections, you're going to be releasing more infections. And so if you're doing a test at month 3, it's going to look very different than the test that you're going to do at month 9. And the last thing that I'll say about it is that the other reason why I treat all of these things at the same time is because I've been burned. Because at 12 months or 18 months, I'm like scratching my head, and all of a sudden I do another test and I'm like, oh, gosh, I really wish that we had started treating your mold back in month 3 because you'd be done with the protocol now. And so now what I figured out is to save time, money, and effort is to treat them all. And I do it in a way that the body can tolerate. So, I want people to feel just a little bit worse so that we know what's happening, but I want them to be able to still live their lives and be able to continue to improve along the way.
Do people I talk to tell me that some of their best learning or insight comes from those more challenging cases, of the outliers that don't seem to be responding the same as people typically do? So do you find that in your practice, and what sorts of things do you learn from those cases?
Absolutely. And that's, I'm constantly learning because of that. And so, that's why we recently added nervous system retraining to our program 6 months ago, is because I saw enough evidence that people were having a lot of success with it. And so we needed to add it. And it's not an in-depth nervous system retraining program like the Gupta program or Primal Trust or some of these other ones, but it provides the basic. And oftentimes it's hard for people to do 2 programs at once. And so we have a basic version, we have a more advanced version. We do have calls with somebody who's gone through the Primal Trust program where she's leading people in practices. And so we have I think, a strong component of it. But I think that's the most obvious new addition that we've made to the program, or the newest thing that I've learned. But, as they say, by your patients and your clients, you'll be taught. And I try to listen to them every single day for that. Like, what is the next thing that I have to learn? And that's kind of part of how I got better too, is, finding the toxic 5, we're all about what are the holes in my learning. I had a patient at that time who, came in with Lyme symptoms, and I didn't know anything about Lyme. And I didn't want to treat Lyme. Lyme is very complex, and I didn't want to treat it at all. But, he came back to me afterwards and said, hey, I came to you and you didn't figure this out. I had to go someplace else. They figured it out and they really helped me. And I thought to myself, oh crap, I have to learn this now. And then it was even more strongly emphasized for me when I had to learn it for myself, because I had Lyme and its co-infections. And then my wife is waking up in the middle of the night with panic attacks, and we figure out that it's Babesia, and we treat the Babesia and the panic attacks go away. So there's all these different messages, I believe, from the universe that, are kind of leading me. And I just have to listen in order to be able to learn the things I need to learn in order to help more people.
We talk a lot on this channel, and with the people that I interview tell me that mindset was really important in their recovery. So do you see that? And if so, what sort of mindsets are either helpful or maybe get in the way of recovery?
Absolutely. So part of our nervous system retraining process in our program is a 4-step mindset practice. So the first step is gratitudes. Lots of really good research on 3 gratitudes a day. Where fear lives and anxiety live, or where gratitude lives, fear and anxiety cannot live, right? And then the next step is envisioning your ideal health, envisioning your ideal day. The brain really doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. How does it feel when you're watching a horror film, right? You kind of feel like you're there. And if you close your eyes and you picture yourself on a beach, you can actually change your nervous system to feeling this way. And it's the same thing with envisioning what your ideal health would look like. Step 3 is looking at any limiting beliefs that you have and flipping them into empowering beliefs. And then step 4 is looking at any disempowering questions that you're asking yourself and asking yourself a more empowering question. Like, how can I love myself more today? Or what is a baby step that I can take today in my health? And mindset is incredibly key to this whole process. And part of it is that the process takes a while. Like I mentioned previously, I tell people that the expectation is that it's going to take at least 12 months for you to get better. The magic happens around month 9, but I don't really know how long it's going to take to get all the toxins out completely. Generally people are 60 to 100% better at 12 months, but I don't know for sure. And so having a mindset of understanding that it's going to take a while makes a big difference today, because you're able to understand what you need to do, but you have this different view of how long it's going to take. But you also understand that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And if you don't take a step every single day, you're not going to reach your goal. So
So,
that combination I find to be most helpful.
such important information to put out too, as well, or setting the expectation of this is going to take time, because we do have examples of rapid recovery stories. And I always try to reiterate that rapid success is the exception. It's not the norm. It's like there are people who win the lottery. There are people who start a YouTube channel and have 1 million followers in 3 months. And there are people who recover in weeks or a couple of months from these very serious conditions. But when it's not happening to you, it's like waking up every day and beating yourself up for not winning the lottery. Yes, of course, those examples exist and they stick in our minds because they're so, impactful. But for the overwhelming majority of people, this is going to take some time.
Right. I agree. Yeah. And I think that, yeah, what you said about the mindset is key. It is going to take some time. And in general, when it happens quickly, it's usually from the nervous system retraining.
So I have a lot of people reach out to me and say, I have this specific thing going on, or I have ADHD, or I had a head injury, or I had 1,000 other things. And for that reason, they understandably feel, because they're not seeing themselves exactly reflected in the recovery stories, like, will this program help me? Is it possible for me to recover? So how do you know if you could help people? And are there cases where it's just that these protocols aren't going to be effective?
So I'm always recommending that people work with a specialist. And so I'm a specialist in chronic fatigue syndrome, and long COVID. So, somebody who has ADHD should not work with me. I had somebody yesterday who was asking me about migraine headaches. It's like migraine headaches that are part of chronic fatigue syndrome, I can help you with. But if you just have migraine headaches, it's not my bag, and you should go look for somebody who specializes in migraine headaches, because that's what they do all day long, right? If I want to learn the piano, I go and I get a piano teacher. I don't ask my mechanic how to learn piano, right? And it's the same thing with, vice versa. If I need to fix my car, I go to a mechanic. I don't go to my piano teacher, right? And chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID are worlds away from what a functional medicine doctor, natural medicine, integrative medicine, conventional medicine doc does on a regular basis. So that's the first thing, is make sure you're working with a specialist. And in terms of the people that I can help, when I get on free calls with people to see whether or not we're a good fit to work together. And on that call, I'm trying to figure out, have they addressed the toxic 5 completely? And do they have the mindset or the ability to work through a program for 12 months? If people have really bad brain fog, unfortunately, it doesn't work. Unfortunately, it's just not, it's just too hard to do with my current setup. If people are willing to work on their mental, emotional health, I can help them because they're willing to do the nervous system retraining. For people who are like, and they're probably, that's probably most people watching this, which is great. But for people who are like, no, I don't want to work with that stuff, I tell them, I don't think that I can help you, because the nervous system component may be 90% or it may be 10%.
Right.
For some people, I ask them, are you coachable? If I give you a plan and you agree to the plan, are you able to implement that plan if I'm checking with you on the regular and all that sorts of stuff? And so if they're not, or they're not willing to do certain things, they're not willing to change their diet, they're not willing to go to a biologic dentist and getting a cone beam CT to look for hidden infections in the jaw, they're not willing to test their home for mold, like, I know that some of these things sound overwhelming, and we're there with you along the way, and we're going to hold your hand along the way so that you are going to be successful. But you have to be willing to take the first step, and you have to be willing to be courageous, and potentially you have to be willing to do the things that you aren't willing to do. Quick story is that a lot of people with long COVID, they started off, being conventional. A lot of people I'm seeing right now as I'm getting on calls with them, and they started off being more conventionally minded. They went to their conventional doc, they went to a COVID clinic. Then they're like, oh, this isn't working for me. Then they go to a naturopath, a functional medicine doc, and then they end up coming to my doorstep. But it's 4 years later because it kind of took them along this path of realizing that they weren't getting results. So if somebody, I had somebody join my program last year who got better from long COVID, but I had a call with him 2 years prior, and he was like, I don't want to do any of this woo-woo medicine, right? And so I was like, okay, maybe we'll have a conversation next year. And 2 years after that, he got on a call. He said, now I'm willing to do anything. He did what I recommended, and he got better.
Listen, I was just thinking as you're speaking, give him time. He'll get there.
Yeah.
Pretty soon he'll be trying anything and everything because I've talked to so many people on these journeys. And one is that you get to that place of, sure, if it worked for one person, I'm willing to give it a try. And I don't think there's anyone for whom this isn't overwhelming. So I love that when people work with you, they have support and a guide because most of us are out there watching videos and reading stuff and on our own, like, okay, I guess I got my home tested for mold. Okay, I'll go see that dentist. Oh, well, but you're just trying to figure it out and piece it all together yourself and not knowing what the next logical step is. So, yeah, I hear that it's a lot of stuff, but having someone to guide you through that, oh my goodness, I would have given anything for that going through my own journey.
And
So
that's
I
the
think
biggest
that's,
thing, really, is because there's always bumps in the road. There's always
yeah.
questions, and you want somebody in your back pocket. And I guarantee a response to any question that people have in 2 business days. So they don't have to wait too long. They can keep pivoting. This is really like, if I were to call this a certain type of medicine, it's like pivotology or something like that. Where you just have to keep pivoting because so many people, they get stuck, right? They do that a test to look for mold in their home. They find out they have mold. They're like, what do I do next? Right. And then they have to do all this research and they feel like crap and they've got brain fog and, all that sort of stuff. So, you can just compress time by working with a specialist who is going to be able to provide that kind of support.
And I think too, when you're doing it on your own, it's easy to zero in on that one thing. Like, oh, there's mold. I've figured out the problem.
Right.
I'll move, I'll get better. But then they move, they get a little bit better, but they go, oh, wait, I'm still not there. So yeah, there's a lot of different things to look at.
Right.
Yeah. So if someone's brand new to this right now and they're listening or watching, like what would your recommendation for them be to do?
Yeah, I mean, they're probably, it's drinking from a fire hydrant. It's overwhelming. These are topics that you've never heard mentioned before, potentially. And I think that you have to, I think it comes back to working with a specialist, right? Whenever you have a problem, if you have an HR problem at work, like, what are you going to do? You're going to figure out what the problems are. You're going to figure out what your causes are, and then you're going to fix them. And if you need to hire somebody to help you do that, you're going to do that. It's part of what happens when you go to a doctor. You go to a doctor and you expect them to help with all of your medical problems if you don't feel well, right? And the reality is that they are not potentially trained to do that. But I think if you are new to this and you're thinking about, well, actually, yeah, so you want to find a specialist. But one of the things that you can do initially is you can do the nervous system retraining. It's the cheapest way to go. Nervous system retraining and lifestyle habits. Like, drink 3 liters of water a day, put some salt in it to help your adrenals, get 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, move your body as much as you can without feeling worse. If you're feeling worse, decrease on the amount that you're moving. I call it Goldilocks dose of movement. And then eat a healthy diet. I recommend paleo for most people starting off. So no gluten, no dairy, no grains, meat and vegetables. Do that and do the nervous system retraining. And then if you're not better at that point, then reach out to me or somebody like me to go after the rest of the Toxic 5. And so I would do that for about 6 months.
And for people listening and watching, I mean, the great thing is that there's a ton of free information out there, and you have a YouTube channel as well. So we'll link that here so people can go there and check it out if they want to learn more about what you're doing in your program and if this might be a good fit for them. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been so helpful. I really appreciate everything that you've shared. I'm going to link to, I'm thinking of, it's so incredible to see so many people in the conventional medical system who are effectively treating these conditions, because not too long ago that was not the case. And I know not everyone can get themselves into a doctor's office with a physician who is trained in that, but the great thing is that now people like yourself are accessible globally.
Right.
So that's not needed. I'm also going to link an interview I did with a wonderful woman named Rebecca Kennedy, who is effectively treating these approaches, and a lot of it in line with what you're saying. So if what Dr. Hirsch is saying and you'd like to learn more about this is another great one to check out. And of course, everything for Dr. Hirsch will be linked in the description. So if you want to learn more about him, check out his channel, find out ways to get in touch with him. That will definitely all be available for them there. So yes, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And thank you to everyone watching and listening, and I hope to see you in this next video with Dr. Kennedy.